the trouble began with the moneylenders. They were likely the original inhabitants of the central city zones of mainland Greece, and as international trade became more frequent in the Ionian and Aegean seas, the value of their land would have increased dramatically as these growing urban settlements were transformed into thriving centers of commerce. With trade came new commodities from every corner of the Mediterranean, along with new markets, creating an economy based on money, and this new money economy brought quick and sudden change to the Greek-speaking world. But despite the relatively advanced state of economic development in Greece, the Greeks were still very much a tribal people who still measured their wealth in terms of land rather than minted coins. And nowhere else in Greece was this more true than in Attica. Surrounded by the sea on all but one side, Attica is a triangular peninsula that extends into the Aegean from the rugged shores of mainland Greece, from which it is separated by a string of mountains that form a natural barrier along the peninsula's northern border. In the northwestern corner of Attica lies the city-state of Athens, a seafaring nation located roughly 5 miles from the Mediterranean coast, and by the 7th century BCE the Athenians had established full control of Attica, annexing the entire peninsula and its 12 major towns. But Attica was a mountainous region, much like the rest of Greece. The soil there was thin, unsuitable for sustaining a wide variety of crops. And in a country always short of arable farmland, political power in Athens rested entirely with a small group of families whose power was tied to their ownership of land. This was the landed aristocracy, and together they formed the Athenian ruling class. And these warrior aristocrats spent the majority of their time fighting petty wars against neighboring cities over control of land. Like many of its neighbors, Athens was once ruled by a king called the Basileus, although it is likely more accurate to compare the position to that of a chieftain or warlord, passed down familial lines from father to son. But at some point, the aristocrats abolished the monarchy and began ruling together as a collective, replacing the regime with an oligarchy, and participation in the government was reserved for the so-called well-born of Athens. And because they owned such a large portion of the arable land in Attica, the landowners were powerful enough to dictate the price of food, while the poorer farmers living in the periphery faced economic ruin as a result. The landowners began offering loans to the smallholder farmers of rural Attica, who had little choice but to accept the loans, as they desperately needed the money to purchase seed and other supplies to get them through to the following season. In reality, the moneylenders never expected to be paid back. It was a land speculation scheme. The loan was simply a way for the moneylenders to obtain even more land to add to their growing estates. It was a one-time investment, and far cheaper than what they would have paid if they had purchased the property at market value. If by some miracle the debtor managed to pay back the loan, then so be it. But that almost never happened. Almost always, the debtor would be unable to pay back the loan, and would have to default. And because these modest farmers had nothing other than their land and their own labor power to put up as collateral to secure the loan, the poor farmers of rural Attica had effectively mortgaged off their property to these predatory moneylenders. And once the debtor defaulted, the moneylenders could legally seize their property. And in a very short span of time, mortgage columns sprang up throughout the countryside of Attica. The luckiest among the ruined farmers were able to continue living on their former properties, forced to hand over 4/5 of what they produced to their ruthless new landlord. But for most of these farmers, the situation was far worse. In most cases, the value of the debt exceeded the value of the mortgaged property by the time the debtor defaulted, and if that was the case, the debtor was forced by law to sell his own children into slavery abroad in order to help cover the debt. And if even that was not enough, the debtor himself was enslaved. But oppression of such magnitude is unsustainable, and the ruling class feared nothing more than the many-headed hydra of social revolution. Concerned over the possibility of mass revolt, the landlords had little choice but to accept changes to the political system. In 594 BCE, a reformer named Solon was appointed chief lawgiver of Athens. Tasked with resolving the social crisis, Solon's goal was to act as a mediator between the contending social classes in order to alleviate the tension between them. And that was exactly what he did. Upon taking office, Solon swiftly ended the practice of debt bondage. All debts were cancelled, and the enslavement of Athenian citizens was banned. Mortgaged land was returned to the original owners, and incredibly, Solon's government was able to successfully track down everyone sold into slavery over unpaid debt, and returned them safely to their families. But Solon's reforms went even further than that. He abolished the old tribal system, in which political rights were reserved for the aristocracy alone, replacing it with a four-tiered system, in which political power was determined by wealth rather than land ownership and family name. Solon's reforms created a far more moderate aristocratic government that allowed limited participation in civic society, depending on which of the four tiers one occupied. Elected bodies were established, including a general assembly, while legal matters were decided by large juries whose members were chosen by lot. Solon had avoided revolution, but the class struggle continued as a new mercantile class emerged to challenge the landed aristocracy for control over the political system. These were the new rich of Athens, whose fortunes were made through commerce, and they measured their wealth in gold and silver coins instead of land. And as they became more powerful, this mercantile class gradually pushed aside the old landed aristocracy in their ongoing struggle to replace them as the new ruling class in Athens. This ongoing struggle led to the emergence of charismatic tyrants, populist politicians with considerable wealth whose political career was built on the support of wide sections of the citizen body, in Athens and in many other Greek nations during the 6th century BCE. In fact, the word tyrant was not inherently negative and carried none of its modern implications. In fact, a tyrant's political career was entirely dependent on mass political support, which they typically earned by enacting policies that improved the lives of the poorest citizens in order to advance their political careers. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, a politician named Pisistratus seized control of the Athenian state in a coup and declared himself tyrant. And by the end of his rule decades later, Athens had become a formidable naval and commercial power. Meanwhile, a different nation further to the west had a very different experience than Athens had. To the southwest of Attica lies a large peninsula called the Peloponnesus, connected to central Greece via the Isthmus of Corinth, while the Saronic Gulf separates Attica from its northeastern shore. In the southern region of the Peloponnesus lies Sparta, an inland nation located in the fertile Laconia Valley, a kind of hidden paradise bisected by the Eurotias River and completely surrounded by mountains. The overland route through Boeotia and across the Isthmus of Corinth is just under 100 miles between Athens and Sparta, a journey that required several days due to the rugged terrain, and the two cities could not have been more perfect opposites. While the traditional well-born families in Athens were pushed aside by an emerging mercantile class, the aristocratic families in Sparta cemented their rule in place with the constitution of Lycurgus around 650 BCE. Essentially, it was a series of drastic reforms that effectively established a permanent militarist regime in Sparta, headed by two kings ruling simultaneously from two different royal bloodlines, whose authority was backed by an aristocratic council of elders and several magistrates. The militarization of civilian life in Sparta was tied to the Messenian Wars, in which the Spartans conquered the neighboring region of Messenia and subjugated its people to a nightmare existence. Stripped of their cultural identity, the Messenians were referred to only as helots from that point onward, a word that simply means slave. But unlike a typical slave in the ancient world, the helots could not be sold or purchased in any market. Instead, all helots were the property of the Spartan state and had absolutely no rights. The Spartans annexed Messenia, giving them control of the entire southern and southwestern region of the Peloponnesus. Meanwhile, the helots were forced into permanent servitude, toiling as strangers in their own land for a people who stole their country from them. They were bound to the soil, ensuring every plot of land came with its own built-in workforce, serving whichever Spartan family owned the property. And with all labor-related tasks taken care of by the helots, Spartan citizens had nothing but free time. For male Spartans, that free time was dedicated almost entirely to combat training, while Spartan women were to focus their energy on creating and raising the next generation of Spartan citizens, a high priority in a country with such an abnormally low birth rate. Of course, the militarization of social life in Sparta quickly transformed the Spartans into the most powerful military force in all of Greece. Sparta itself was famously without any walls, and it was common for Spartan citizens to remark that their walls were the outstretched spears of their warriors. But their arrogance only concealed a deep existential fear, shared by every Spartan citizen. Not a foreign invasion, but a threat much closer to home. For in reality, what the Spartans truly feared more than anything else was not an enemy army, but the oppressed helots who served them in their own homes. An entire population of angry and exploited people with absolutely nothing to lose was dangerous for obvious reasons, made worse by the fact that the Helot population outnumbered Spartan citizens by a significant margin. And there was no going back. The Spartans had restructured their entire society around the exploitation of Helot labor, on which they had become hopelessly dependent. Their labor supported the entire Spartan social order, and every Spartan citizen was acutely aware that a successful Helot revolt would almost certainly be the end of Sparta. That was the truth behind the Lycurgus reforms. No foreign enemy could ever scare the Spartans. What did scare them was the potential loss of their social system, despite their extreme and rather austere lifestyle that came with it. While other cities throughout the Greek world were leaving behind their tribal past, Sparta had effectively reinstated the old tribal constitution, in which all resources belonged to the members of the tribe, most significantly the tribal lands now under the ownership of the state. And the state allocated plots of land to its citizens as compensation for their military service, much like the traditional tribal customs had done. And because the Spartans had access to an abundance of land and a virtually unlimited supply of free labor, the landed aristocracy had no need to exploit their fellow citizens. But this unusual situation also meant that Sparta was an inward-looking culture, and they had little desire to interact with the outside world. Sparta was not a seafaring nation, and they did not care to engage in commerce, wanting only to freeze in place the social relations of their society, and to prevent change at all costs. Naturally, Sparta was a conservative society, and had established itself early on as an international haven for reactionaries from all corners of the Greek-speaking world. These were bitter aristocrats from other Greek cities, and they plotted endlessly against the masses they so feared and despised. Thus, Sparta became the headquarters of the international counter-revolution, and an enemy of a movement soon to be known as democracy, and the epicenter of the democratic revolution was Athens. In 527 BCE, the tyrant Pisistratus died, leaving the regime to the care of his two sons, Hipparchus and Hippias, and while the first several years of their rule were uneventful, the Athenians would soon experience firsthand the darker aspects of tyranny. In 514 BCE, Hipparchus was stabbed to death by two assassins in front of a crowd of horrified witnesses during the public parade at the Panathenaic Games. One of his attackers was killed immediately by the tyrant's security team, and the other assassin fled the scene but was captured by security forces shortly thereafter. The assassins were a pair of male lovers named Harmodius and Aristogeiton, and despite later being portrayed as revolutionaries, the two of them were not politically motivated at all. In fact, they had killed Hipparchus over a personal feud after the tyrant had publicly humiliated Harmodius's sister, after the young man had rejected the tyrant's advances towards him. Harmodius had been the one killed on the spot immediately after stabbing Hipparchus. Aristogeiton met a gruesome end while in custody, and was ultimately tortured and killed alongside his wife. The family members of both assassins were rounded up and beheaded by the regime. But Hippias was never the same after the incident. He fell into a depression and grew more bitter and paranoid with every passing day, and he channeled his resentment through the use of state terror, and his regime dealt out brutal acts of retribution against a growing list of enemies. Execution, exile, and the confiscation of property were frequent occurrences, and that was more than enough to turn the public against him. A plot was organized to overthrow the tyrant, an effort spearheaded by the wealthy Alcmaeonid family. Exiled from Athens during the rule of Pisistratus, the Alcmaeonids once held significant influence in Athenian politics and were part of the new mercantile elite. The head of the Alcmaeonid family was Cleisthenes, and he organized a coup in 510 BCE to overthrow Hippias, and he turned to an unlikely ally for help. It would turn out that Sparta was also interested in regime change in Athens. Hoping to install a pro-Spartan government in Athens, King Cleomenes I of Sparta agreed to provide troops to support the coup. The first attempt failed, but after formulating a better strategy, the conspirators tried again, and Spartan troops invaded Athens a second time, while Hippias and his forces took refuge behind the fortified stone walls of the city Acropolis. Constructed during the Late Bronze Age, the Acropolis of Athens was one of several fortified citadels scattered across mainland Greece. The fortress had long been abandoned by its builders, and had since become the central landmark of Athens, as well as its spiritual center and the headquarters of the government. And the temple of the city goddess Athena was one of several public buildings that had since been built on top of what remained of the structure. And while the Acropolis had not been used as an actual fortress for a very long time, it still provided shelter for anyone seeking refuge behind its walls who had a major advantage, as they only had to defend a single access point below them on the ground. And because the Acropolis was built on top of a natural spring, its defenders also had access to an unlimited supply of drinking water. The Spartan troops surrounded the base of the Acropolis and prepared for a long siege. But Hippias eventually surrendered after receiving word that his children had been captured as hostages. And after negotiating the safe passage of he and his family out of the city, Hippias hastily departed Athens and never returned. The coup was victorious. In its aftermath, the common people of Athens rallied behind Cleisthenes and the Alcmaeonid faction as their new leaders. However, the Spartans had other plans. The Spartan king Cleisthenes viewed the Alcmaeonid faction as too radical and decided that it would not be in Sparta's interest to allow Cleisthenes to form a new government in Athens. And with his troops still present in the city, Cleisthenes chose to ally with the reactionaries and the old landed aristocracy instead. The Spartans backed a faction of Athenian conservatives led by an aristocrat named Isagoras, who then returned Athens to oligarchic rule. The people of Athens tolerated these new oligarchs for 2 years before they decided to take action against them. In 508 BCE, a coalition of merchants, smallholder farmers, and landless urban poor united in revolution against the oligarchs and instigated a revolt against the regime. The common people took to the streets, forcing the oligarchs to take refuge on the Acropolis, defended by their Spartan bodyguards. Realizing their puppet regime was unsustainable with the entire city against them, the Spartans gave up and withdrew all their troops from the city, accompanied by their Athenian allies who were forced to leave the city in exile. The revolution was victorious. According to the historian Herodotus, the Alcmaeonid family made their fortune after their ancestor Alcmaeon was rewarded by King Croesus for doing him a favor. Croesus was famously wealthy, and he told Alcmaeon he could take as much gold from his treasury as he could physically carry with him. And so Alcmaeon returned dressed in loose clothing and boots, filling them with as much gold as he could fit inside them. When he ran out of space in his clothing, Alcmaeon stuffed more gold inside his mouth, packed his hair with gold dust, and anywhere else he could find to carry more of it with him. The king was so amused at the sight of this that he allowed Alcmaeon to return and take even more of his gold, sending him home with a literal fortune. The Alcmaeonid family had lived in luxury ever since. They were part of the new elite in Athens, and unlike the reactionaries within the traditional landowning families, the Athenian new rich tended to be optimistic and forward-thinking in their worldview, eager to lead Athens into a bright future. But the Alcmaeonid family had lost the political struggles that had unfolded in the middle of the 6th century BCE, resulting in their exile from Athens, and they were alienated from the rest of their social class as a result. And so, with no other options left, the Alcmaeonids did something unusual. They turned to the masses for support, and they quickly discovered that the loyalty of the common people was far more valuable than that of their own social class. Thus, from that day onward, the Alcmaeonid family established themselves as the leaders of the pro-democracy faction in Athens, and their patriarch Cleisthenes was the undisputed champion of the people. Following the removal of the Spartan puppet regime in 508 BCE, Cleisthenes was recalled from exile and asked to form a new government in Athens. So he did, and the results were truly unprecedented. Cleisthenes implemented a series of radical reforms unlike anything that had ever been seen before in human history. First, he divided the entire population of Attica into more than 100 demes, which essentially functioned as local administrative units. Typically, each deme was around the size of a village or a neighborhood, and was managed by a leader and a council, elected by the people who lived there. Cleisthenes abolished the reformed wealth-based tribal system that Solon had implemented and created 10 new tribes to replace it. Now, for the first time ever, the population was categorized according to where they lived instead of land ownership or even monetary wealth, while the boundaries were drawn in a way that ensured each of the 10 tribes contained deans from urban, rural, and coastal regions of Attica. And just like that, Athens became a democracy. Now, the highest governing body in democratic Athens was the Ecclesia, a popular assembly open to all male citizens of voting age. The assembly met on a mound of rock called the Pnyx Hill, located due west of the Acropolis. All decisions made by the state had to be approved by the Ecclesia, and the assembly met frequently. Anyone present at the meetings had the right to speak before the assembly to make a proposal, and every decision was made by simple majority vote after all perspectives were heard and discussed. And through this process, the citizens of Athens worked together to turn the wheels of the state. Through the democratic system, the people became their own rulers. Nowhere else in the ancient world was there another society where an aristocrat, a merchant, a farmer, and a landless artisan held equal political power. But in Athens, the wealthiest citizen and the poorest citizen were allotted the same number of votes for every decision made by the state. And that number was 1, no matter who they were. In addition to the Ecclesia, there were other governing bodies as well, such as the Boulae, a council of 500 whose members were chosen by lot. In addition to preparing the agendas for the Ecclesia to discuss and vote on at their meetings, the Boulae was also responsible for enforcing its decisions. Among other things, the Boulae was tasked with overseeing many of the city's magistrates and public officials to ensure they were doing their jobs, and they managed the state's finances as well. Meanwhile, legal matters were decided by the popular courts, and all judicial decisions were made by large juries, whose members were also chosen by lot as a safeguard against corruption. Inevitably, popular individuals emerged to lead the masses. And due to the constant warfare that periodically broke out between neighboring Greek cities, the military leadership was a matter of paramount importance, especially when a single military engagement often decided the fate of entire nations. For this reason, the most popular politicians in Athens were also the leaders who formed the high command of the Athenian military. In fact, it was an elected office, known as the strategos, equivalent to a commanding general in the army. There were 10 of these generals at any one time, and together they formed the leadership of the Athenian armed forces. Naturally, the de facto leader of democratic Athens was always one of these 10 generals. And while their duties were mostly related to planning and executing military campaigns, their opinions carried significant weight at the Pnyx Hill, and thus wielded considerable influence in the decisions of the Athenian state. And despite serving terms of just 1 year, there were no term limits, and popular generals were often re-elected for several years in a row. This was Athenian democracy. Of course, by modern standards, it wasn't perfect. Democracy in Athens was reserved only for its male citizens, and women had no rights at all. Most women lived an idle domestic life in the home of her husband, and they were prohibited by law from appearing in public without a male escort, unless she was part of a group of other women. But this was the norm in most of the ancient world. There were many foreign residents living in Athens, known as metics, and they also had no rights in Athens because they were not citizens. Again, that was not unusual in the ancient world at all. Slavery was also quite common in the ancient world, and Athens was no exception in that regard either, as virtually every urban society in the world practiced some form of legalized slavery at the time. Athens was unusual only because of the high number of slaves passing through Athenian markets every day. Usually slaves were considered luxury items due to their high cost, and even one slave was typically unaffordable for the average family. Generally speaking, only the very wealthy owned slaves. It simply wasn't practical to rely on slave labor as the primary workforce on a social scale. After all, slaves had no incentive to improve the productivity of their labor. Their lives were no less miserable whether they worked efficiently or not. This is why heavy coercion and supervision was necessary. They had nothing to lose. In other words, slave labor was wasteful. Most of the ancient world relied on the labor of free peasants in rural communities in the countryside surrounding the urban centers as the primary labor force to reproduce the conditions of social life on a daily basis. The rulers in the cities would send out their enforcers to collect a portion of the surplus produce harvested by each peasant household, and that surplus fed the people in the cities and sustained the entire society. Thus, slaves were merely a source of pleasure for the ruling class. But there were rare exceptions. Under certain conditions, an abundance of slaves could oversaturate the market enough to drive down the cost per slave by a significant margin. And once the market price of a slave passes below a certain threshold, they suddenly cease being luxury items and become affordable for the average family. Only then does slave labor become a viable option for use as the primary method of social reproduction, instead of free peasants in the countryside paying tribute to the rulers in the cities. These are known as slave societies, and ancient Athens was one of them. After Solon's reforms, it was no longer acceptable to enslave fellow Athenian citizens, and there was an unspoken rule that no Greek nation should ever enslave another Greek-speaking people, as Sparta had done to their Messenian neighbors. But foreign slaves were an increasingly common sight throughout the major cities of the Greek world, and the number of slaves passing through the Athenian port of Piraeus increased with every passing year. They came from far-flung foreign lands. Most of them were taken captive during war, either as civilians whose city fell to a besieging army, or as soldiers captured alive by the enemy after a defeat in battle. Others were members of tribal societies on the periphery of the civilized world, kidnapped by armed raiding parties from the cities and sold cheap as slaves to merchant traffickers, who flooded the markets of Greece as international conflicts became more frequent throughout the Mediterranean. And by the end of the 6th century BCE, the typical Athenian household could afford to purchase one slave for the family. In Athens, the oikos was the basic unit of the economy, and typically referred to a household business, usually a small farm or workshop. And most slaves spent their days assisting the head of the household with his business under varying levels of supervision, and were responsible for the domestic chores of the household. Often, the slave had to learn the trade himself, and it was not uncommon for a slave to be permitted to earn money on the side in their own time. If he was skilled enough, a slave could even earn enough money to reimburse his own purchasing price, and there are documented cases of slaves buying their own freedom from their masters, an impossible dream for the unfortunate helots of Sparta. Of course, the lives of two slaves could differ wildly in Athens. The unluckiest ones would spend their days extracting silver from the laurium mines of southeastern Attica, or forced into sexual servitude. On the other hand, slaves who were literate were highly valued and tended to live better than other slaves, some purchased by the wealthy as tutors for their children, or more often as scribes working for the government as a public slave owned by the Athenian state. In fact, public slaves were responsible for maintaining the daily operations of the government. Even the public security force in Athens was composed of highly skilled archers, all public slaves imported from Thrace. Effectively, the citizens of Athens had liberated themselves from slavery at the hands of the landed aristocracy by importing cheap foreign slaves to replace their own labor, allowing the smallholder farmers of Attica to march confidently into the 5th century BCE, securely in possession of both their land and their freedom. And over the course of the following 2 centuries, the democratic revolution would spread across the Greek-speaking world. And around half of the more than 1,000 independent states scattered throughout the Greek islands and mainland would be ruled by citizen governments at some point during that time, including the nations of Samos, Argos, Corinth, Rhodes, Syracuse, and Thebes, to name the more powerful examples. But while the Eastern Mediterranean world was being transformed by the forces of class struggle and revolution, a new threat was looming in the east. On the western edge of the Iranian plateau lies a region of the Zagros Mountains the Greeks once called Parsa, better known today as Persia. The people who lived there were shepherd warriors, constantly on the move in search of grazing land for their animals, as agriculture was unsustainable at such a high altitude. And prior to the 6th century BCE, they remained as they were, hidden away from the world of the cities below them, as subjects of the Median Empire. But then a king named Cyrus descended the slopes of the mountains at the head of an enormous army and conquered half the civilized world, sweeping aside their Median overlords and the primitive Bronze Age states of Assyria and Babylon as they advanced across Asia. By the time of his death, Cyrus had created the largest empire the world had ever seen. This was Achaemenid Persia, a vast empire stretching all the way into mountainous Afghanistan in the east, and Cyrus's successors would conquer Egypt. In the west, Cyrus had conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia and advanced across Anatolia all the way to the shores of the Aegean Sea. Anatolia is an ancient name for a land the Greeks called Asia Minor, the westernmost part of continental Asia, where modern-day Turkey is now, on the eastern side of the Aegean. The the western shores of Anatolia were known as Ionia at the time, and the thriving cities along the coast were very much a part of the Greek-speaking world. The name Ionia refers to the Ionian Sea, a body of water relatively far away from the shores of Ionia, located to the west of the Aegean, just south of the Adriatic, filling the space between the western coast of the Greek mainland and the shores of southern Italy and Sicily further west. Just a few centuries earlier, tribes of seafaring people migrated east from the Ionian Sea region, perhaps from the fertile coast of Italy or Sicily, eventually settling throughout the Greek islands and mainland. However, the majority of these seafaring migrants settled along the coast of western Anatolia, and they came to be known as the Ionian Greeks. And much like their cousins on the western side of the Aegean, the Ionian Greeks were a fiercely independent people. And so when a Persian army arrived in Ionia to complete their conquest of Western Asia, the Greek-speaking residents of the busy port cities along the coast were already plotting to expel them from their world. From the perspective of the Greeks, life under Achaemenid Persia was slavery, and they would bow to no man, including the so-called King of Kings in the East, preferring to reserve that kind of reverence for their gods. At the time of the Persian conquest of Ionia, the cities along the Anatolian coast were thriving centers of commerce, and had recently become the epicenter of a philosophical awakening. And their new Persian overlords had no reason to suppress these intellectual movements. In fact, the rulers of Achaemenid Persia were content to allow their subjects to worship whatever gods they wished, and had no interest in suppressing local customs and cultural practices in the places that they conquered. In fact, the Persians were even known to allow the local elites of newly conquered territory to remain in place to continue ruling their people, as long as they paid what they owed to the central government. Indeed, the Achaemenid regime could be relatively flexible towards their many subject peoples. The Persians had just one primary concern, on which the regime was unwilling to compromise, and that was the collection of tax revenue from their far-flung territories. After all, this was the source of their immense wealth. As long as their subjects paid what they owed to the state, they could live their lives with very little interaction with the regime. But the Ionian Greeks were unwilling to hand over any of their wealth, and they would soon learn firsthand the consequences of resisting the Persian Empire. Significant among the Ionian cities was Miletus, a major port town and an emerging cultural center, home to renowned thinkers like Thales and Anaximander, among others. In 499 BCE, Miletus was ruled by a tyrant named Aristagoras, who until recently had governed his people with the consent of the Persian state. But Aristagoras had fallen out of favor with the Achaemenid regime after a failed attempt to invade and conquer the island of Naxos. Fearing the Persians were plotting to assassinate him, Aristagoras renounced his own tyranny and stepped down from power, declaring Miletus a democracy. He then ignited a rebellion against Persia that spread rapidly along the coast. And when the rebels requested help from democratic Athens, the Athenians hastily sent troops to assist them, as did the state of Eretria. The Persians were caught by surprise, and the rebels quickly gained the upper hand, winning some early successes that culminated in an attack on the city of Sardis, which the rebels burned to the ground. But Darius I of Persia sent a massive army marching west, and by 494 BCE, the Persians had crushed the revolt. In the years that followed, the Persians re-established control over the region, and dissent was met with state terror. Meanwhile, the king of Persia turned his attention further west. Darius viewed the Western Greeks as a threat, particularly the Athenians, whose intervention in the Ionian revolt was the primary factor that allowed it to continue for as long as it did. In 490 BCE, Darius assembled a large invasion force and set out across the Aegean at the head of an armada, sailing west towards Greece. Upon hearing of this, the Athenians attempted to scramble together a coalition force and sent for help from its neighbors. Of course, any coalition capable of withstanding the forces of Achaemenid Persia required the cooperation of Sparta more than any other Greek state. And the Spartans promised to send troops to Attica to assist the Athenians. After a delay of several days, that is, Sparta was a highly traditional culture, and religion was taken seriously there, more than anywhere else in Greece. And the Spartans happened to be nearing the end of a month-long religious festival dedicated to the sun god Apollo, and thought it inadvisable to engage in warfare before it was over. But the Athenians did not have several days, and their attempts to organize a coalition had failed. Only Plataea actually sent troops to assist Athens. Initially, the Athenians planned to hunker down in defense of their city and try to hold out until the Spartans arrived a few days later. Then, word came back via an Athenian scout that a Persian army had landed unexpectedly near the town of Marathon on the coast of Attica. Seeing a rare opportunity, the Athenian general Miltiades made a bold decision to go on the offensive rather than wait for the enemy to come to them. Joined by their Plataean allies, the Athenians began marching towards Marathon. Unlike the rank and file of the Persian army, the Athenians were not peasant subject peoples, but disciplined and highly motivated hoplite troops, fighting in defense of their property and their freedom. Hoplites were heavy infantry troops, and the phalanx was their most effective weapon. First perfected by the Spartans, the phalanx was a tight block of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, each of them armed with a shield and a very long spear. Moving together in unison, the troops that formed the front line of the phalanx would lock their shields together and brace themselves, creating a solid wall of defense, while the men in the row right behind them would thrust their spears over the top. The Athenian and Plataean force confronted the Persians on a plain near Marathon, catching the invaders completely by surprise. Disorganized and unprepared, the Persians suffered heavy losses early on, unable to withstand the combined weight of the Greek phalanx. The Greeks broke through the Persian lines, prompting them to flee back to their ships, and many others were killed as they fled. The invasion of Greece had already become a disaster, and Darius realized he had underestimated the Western Greeks. And having suffered such a major defeat before the invasion had even begun, Darius decided to cut his losses and abandon the invasion entirely. The Persians retreated to Western Asia. Meanwhile, most of the Greek world erupted in celebration, ecstatic over the unexpected victory, and Miltiades was greeted with a hero's welcome upon returning to Athens. But not everyone was so quick to celebrate, and many were convinced that the Greeks had not seen the last of the Persians. One of these concerned citizens was an Athenian general named Themistocles, and he was certain the Athenians would not be so lucky the next time they faced the Persians in battle. In a land confrontation, that is. As a seafaring nation, Athens had a strong navy, and Themistocles was convinced that their best chance of survival in the event the Persians returned was to ensure that the next confrontation was a naval battle at sea. After all, the Persian navy was the weaker element of their military. Still, the Athenian naval fleet was too small and ill-equipped to realistically face the Persian navy. The Athenians would need to build ships, and a lot of them. And so, when a new vein of silver was discovered within the Laurium mines in 483 BCE, Themistocles knew this was his only chance to make that happen. After all, the new vein of silver meant an influx of state revenue, and the ecclesia would have to decide how to allocate the excess funds pouring into the public treasury. When the assembly met on the Pnyx Hill to discuss the issue, Themistocles stood before his fellow citizens and made his proposal, delivering an impassioned speech. Fortunately, he was a skilled orator, and by the end of his speech, the assembly was convinced. They voted to build more ships, specifically, a fleet of trireme warships. The trireme was a unique and highly dynamic vessel. Every trireme required around 170 oarsmen to operate it, arranged in 3 rows on both sides of the ship. The primary weapon of the trireme was built into its design, a bronze-covered ram at the bow of the vessel, designed to puncture the hulls of enemy ships on impact, tearing through enemy vessels without causing harm to the attacking trireme. In addition to the large teams of oarsmen who maneuvered the ship, each trireme typically carried a small contingent on the deck of the ship as well, prepared to engage the enemy in close combat if necessary. And so the Athenians built their fleet. The Persians returned in 480 BCE, 10 years after the Battle of Marathon, this time under the leadership of Xerxes I, who had succeeded his father Darius as the new king of kings. Xerxes had gathered an enormous army of as many as 200,000 soldiers from every corner of the Persian Empire, supported by a large naval fleet, keeping pace with the army as it traveled north along the Anatolian coast. Xerxes had already sent his engineers ahead to construct floating pontoon bridges at the Hellespont, allowing the great king and his army to cross into Thrace. From there, they began marching south towards Greece. This time, the Greeks were prepared. A massive coalition was organized consisting of at least 700 independent Greek states, and the Spartans were eager to take on a leading role alongside Athens, bringing with them troops from allied nations down on the Peloponnesus as well. The Spartans played a pivotal role early on at Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass that happened to be the only overland route into the heart of mainland Greece for anyone coming from the north. Thermopylae was held by a small force of around 300 Spartan troops commanded by the Spartan king Leonidas, in addition to auxiliary troops from other armies, and a contingent of Thracian troops as well. They managed to hold the pass for 3 days before their resistance finally broke. The defenders of the pass were all killed, but their sacrifice was certainly not in vain, as they had managed to delay the Persian march for a few days and had inflicted heavy losses against the Persians despite being so heavily outnumbered. During the battle at Thermopylae, the Athenians tested their new fleet in a confrontation with the Persian navy in the straits off the northern coast of Euboea, a thin strip of land that runs alongside Attica. The battle went on for 3 long days. Despite the combined Greek force numbering around 270 trireme warships, the Persian fleet was still much larger than the Greek naval force. But the Greeks managed to hold under the command of Themistocles, who used clever tactics such as launching night raids, while his knowledge of the local waters and the directions of the currents gave the Greeks a slight advantage. By the end of the battle, both sides had inflicted significant damage against the other, but neither gained the upper hand. And when Themistocles learned the Persians had defeated the force defending Thermopylae, he realized their position was no longer tenable, now that a full-scale invasion of southern Greece could no longer be avoided. Now, his only priority was to evacuate Athens as soon as possible before the Persians arrived to sack the city. They stood no chance against such a massive army. Thus, Athens was completely evacuated in September 480 BCE. While the women, children, and elderly were transported to the nearby islands of Aegina and Troezen, the military-aged men retreated to the nearby island of Salamis just off the coast. The Persians arrived in Athens shortly thereafter to find the city empty. They began ransacking the city, and by nightfall, a fire had already broken out. The Athenians could see flames licking the dark night sky, and could only look on in silent annoyance as Athens burned. The following day, King Xerxes received a visitor to his luxurious war tent, an Athenian claiming to have defected from the Greek coalition after realizing their situation was hopeless. Of course, Xerxes was intrigued. The defector told the Persian king that the burning of Athens had demoralized many of the rank and file of the coalition, and that the generals were quarreling with each other over strategy. Xerxes also learned that the Athenians had retreated to the island of Salamis, where they were hiding from the Persians. Thus, the defector concluded it would be an opportune moment for the great king to launch a surprise attack on Salamis, while the Greeks were still in a vulnerable position on the island. And Xerxes eagerly took the advice. The Persian fleet was dispatched to Salamis, but King Xerxes had been fooled. General Themistocles had devised a clever plan, in which he would lure the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis between the island and mainland, where their numerical advantage would no longer be useful. Fortunately, Xerxes fell for his trap immediately. As the Persian fleet cautiously entered the strait, the Athenian fleet was lying in wait nearby, just out of sight around a curve in the island's shoreline on the other side of the narrow waterway. Themistocles waited until the entire strait was crowded with Persian ships before giving the order to attack. The Athenian triremes rounded the corner and charged the Persian ships head-on in a well-coordinated attack that took the Persians completely by surprise. Unable to maneuver their ships out of the way, the Persians could do little else other than brace for impact as the Athenian triremes smashed through the hulls of their warships, sinking the Persian fleet one ram attack at a time. The Athenians and their allies devastated the Persian fleet, destroying so many of their ships that King Xerxes was forced to retreat back to Asia with the bulk of his invasion force, leaving behind a smaller contingent under the command of his top general Mardonius to continue the campaign against the Greeks. The following year in 479 BCE, Greek coalition forces under the command of the Spartan general Pausanias confronted Mardonius's army outside Plataea on the plains of Boeotia in central Greece, where the Greeks won a decisive victory. Plataea was a turning point that effectively ended the Persian invasion, and in its aftermath, the coalition capitalized on its successes. In the years that followed, the coalition went on the offensive under the leadership of the Athenians, and they eventually chased the Persians out of the Aegean Sea completely, capturing Byzantium in 478 BCE as they made their way to the east. Naturally, the victory at Salamis propelled Themistocles to the height of his political career, and he became the paramount leader of Athens for several years. But democracy can also be unforgiving, as Themistocles found out for himself. While the revolution had empowered the common citizen, the democratic system also contained a safeguard designed to prevent potential tyrants from seizing control of the state. That safeguard was a practice called ostracism, in which the ecclesia voted to exile an Athenian citizen for a period of 10 years, according to whose name appeared most often once the votes were cast. And despite the widespread support Themistocles had initially enjoyed in the years after his naval victory at Salamis, he had lost the support of the masses by the end of the decade, and was ostracized amid accusations of corruption and bribery. Ironically, Themistocles was granted political asylum by none other than Achaemenid Persia, where he lived under the protection of King Artaxerxes I for the remainder of his life. Following the downfall of Themistocles, a new politician named Cimon quickly took his place as the new rising star in the Athenian political scene. Cimon was the son of Miltiades, the general who led the Greeks to victory at Marathon. He represented a more conservative trend within Athenian democracy, cultivating friendly diplomatic relations with Sparta, whose leaders had returned their focus to internal affairs after the victory at Plataea had virtually eliminated Persia as an existential threat to Greece. General Cimon led the coalition in an aggressive campaign against Persia and achieved several victories. The most significant of these occurred at the Battle of the Eurymedon River in 466 BCE, in which the Persian presence was virtually eliminated in the Aegean. And as the years went on and the threat from Persia was further reduced, the Athenian-led coalition began to shift its focus away from being an anti-Persian defensive force, and towards a more formal military alliance maintained on a permanent basis. This alliance would later be referred to as the Delian League by historians, named after the island of Delos, where the league kept its treasury. Members of the alliance were required to contribute either by providing ships and men, or by making monetary donations. Of course, Athens already provided practically all of the league's warships and men as it was. Thus, most members of the alliance made their contributions in the form of monetary donations to the treasury, which mostly went towards maintaining the Athenian naval fleet for the mutual defense of all members. In reality, it was a kind of protection racket, in which the donations made to the treasury at Delos effectively functioned as tribute paid to the Athenians, whose enormous fleet of trireme warships patrolled the waters in every corner of the Aegean. And with every passing year, it was becoming increasingly obvious that membership in the Delian League was no longer voluntary, and those who threatened to pull out of the alliance could expect to wake up the next morning to find an Athenian trireme fleet blockading their harbor. And with tribute payments flowing into Athens from client states throughout the Greek-speaking world, the Athenians became wealthier than ever, allowing them to repair the damage done by the Persians in record time. The Athenians were more confident than they had ever been, at least since the revolution. So when a Libyan king instigated a revolt in Egypt against Achaemenid Persia, the Athenians saw an opportunity to expand their sphere of influence to the North African coast by expelling the Persians from Egypt. The ecclesia voted to assist the rebellion. The Athenians gathered a substantial contingent of 200 trireme warships carrying an army of hoplite troops. The enormous fleet then set sail for North Africa. Initially, the Athenians and their Egyptian allies achieved some successes. They captured the ancient capital of Memphis from the Persians, and they occupied parts of the Nile River Delta as well during the early stages of the conflict. Then, the tide of the war turned against the rebels, and the situation gradually became worse for the Athenians at that point. Athenian troops remained in Egypt for several years. Finally, the Persians sent a general named Megabyzus to crush the rebellion, and he arrived in Egypt with a large army in 454 BCE. The result was utter disaster for the Athenians. Megabyzus and his army trapped the Athenian forces on an island in the Nile River and besieged the island. The siege went on for several months without either side making progress. But the Persians diverted the course of the river in order to expose the island, allowing the Persian forces to launch a direct assault on the pinned Athenian troops. The Athenians were overwhelmed and suffered a catastrophic defeat. Their entire fleet was obliterated, and most of the Athenians slaughtered, while the few survivors were captured by the enemy. The defeat dealt a serious blow to Athenian military prestige and resources, and in its aftermath the Athenians made a controversial move that sparked widespread outrage by relocating the Delian League treasury from its designated place on Delos to Athens. The Athenians then took the funds and used them to quickly rebuild their fleet. In 450 BCE, The last battle ever fought between the Persians and the Greek coalition was a naval confrontation that ended with a major victory for the Delian League. In the wake of their victory, the Delian League signed a peace treaty with the Achaemenid Persian Empire, bringing their long conflict to an end. But as the Athenians made peace with their longtime enemies, a new enemy emerged to challenge Athens that would pose a much greater threat than the Persians ever had. And this new threat was Sparta. It was no secret that the Spartans hated democracy. The Spartans regarded democracy as radical and extreme, and viewed its spread as an existential threat to Sparta, and the close ties between Sparta and aristocratic reactionaries in Athens were well established. But under the leadership of General Cimon and his conservative faction, Athens and Sparta had maintained cordial diplomatic relations, and Athenian foreign policy was friendly to Sparta under their leadership. But a contradiction was developing within the Spartan ruling class, and a hawkish war party had emerged that was hostile to the Athenians, even with the conservatives in power there. Concerned that the democratic revolution would spread to other Greek states, the war party advocated for an aggressive policy towards Athens, with the ultimate goal of dismantling Athenian democracy altogether. To this end, the Spartans secretly adopted a policy in which they would provide aid and military support to Delian League members if they revolted against Athens. In fact, the Spartans were even planning an invasion of Attica, intending to dismantle Athenian democracy by military force. But the Spartans were forced to abandon their invasion plans due to an act of violence from the gods. In 464 BCE, a powerful earthquake struck the Laconia Valley in the heart of the Peloponnesus, bringing chaos and devastation to Sparta. And by the time the earth had stopped shaking, as many as 20,000 people lay dead, and most of Sparta's homes and public buildings had been reduced to piles of rubble. But the citizens of Sparta had no time to wonder what they may have done to incur the wrath of Poseidon the Earthshaker, for they were now facing their worst nightmare. The Helots had risen in revolt. Despite keeping their captive labor force under close surveillance, the Spartans had grown complacent. And in their brief moment of vulnerability in the aftermath of the earthquake, the desperate Helots capitalized on a rare opportunity. They revolted against their Spartan oppressors, and when the Spartans began a counter-offensive to crush them, the Helot rebels put up a surprisingly strong defense. Unable to put down the rebellion on their own, the Spartans sent for help from their allies, including the Athenians. Eager to assist his Spartan allies, General Cimon assembled a fleet and set out for the Peloponnesus with a force of a few thousand hoplites. However, the Spartans dismissed the Athenians shortly after their arrival. The hawkish faction was convinced that the Athenians' radical politics would cause them to sympathize with the Helots and potentially switch sides to assist the rebellion. And in their moment of crisis, the Spartan leadership was unwilling to take any chances. So they sent the Athenians home. However, they did so without informing them of their reasoning for doing so. And so the Athenians returned to Attica, now harboring major resentments against the Spartans. The Athenians were incensed over the incident, as they were the only ones to be dismissed of all the states that came to assist the Spartans. The Athenians considered it a major insult, and the result was a permanent rift between Sparta and Athens that would never be repaired. It also ended Cimon's political career, and he was removed from office and ostracized upon his return to Athens, departing the city in exile shortly thereafter. The conservatives were defeated, and pro-Spartan policies were no longer acceptable in the eyes of the Athenian public. But the incident would have far-reaching consequences, setting in motion a chain of causality that would eventually bring the two nations to war. Thus began the long and bloody feud between Sparta and Athens, and it would soon tear apart the Greek-speaking world.